Hi again, Megan again. If the first conversation got you thinking about what changes need to happen in our economy and business landscape to have a positive impact in the world, that's good. The rest of the day, we'll touch on more nuanced discussions that cover different aspects that apply to you as an individual, as a business leader, and as a member of our society. And we'll start with talking about the fundamentals. We can't be there for our family, our teams, or anyone else if we're not okay ourselves. In the last few years, the mental health landscape has changed dramatically, with new businesses, new, more experimental therapies, and more access to treatment now than ever before. Please welcome our moderator, Rashana Bide, founder of the Corner of the Court Project, and our panelists, Esther Boykin, CEO of Group Therapy Associates, Paul Brownlee, Chief Health Officer at Accenture, and Dana Udall, Chief Clinical Officer at Headspace Health.
Here we all are. Good morning. Good morning to our panelists and to everybody that's listening. Megan, thanks for that warm introduction because we have a pretty heavy topic, but it's very important. So I'm thrilled to have our panelists who are experts in various ways in mental health and also the technology and some of the things that we are looking at and seeing now as trends in mental health. So I want to start by setting the frame a little bit. And Ellevate provided us a statistic that in 2012, when people were asked what the number one health issue was in their lives, that 3% answered mental health. That was in 2012. Yes, in 2012. And now in 2020, fast forward, that number had increased to 13%. So from 3% to 13%. And that was in 2020. So we're now 2 years on from that. And it feels like this topic is becoming even more prevalent and even more important to people. So as we set the frame for today, I want to ask, I'll start with you, Dr. Udall. When we think about mental health, there's quite a few things that could refer to. It could be stress, anxiety, things we feel at work. It could be deeper things like trauma and clinical diagnoses. So Dr. Udall, maybe you can kick us off by telling us how Headspace looks at this topic and what's within the boundaries of this discussion.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as well as all of us at Headspace Health and all of you in the audience, I assume, as well. So we have seen really a sea change when it comes to talking about mental health. When I went into the field about 25 years ago, it was definitely very hush-hush. People didn't talk about their mental health issues. The idea of raising your hand or going to your employer and saying, I need support or I need some benefits that relate to mental health wouldn't have been fathomable. So the good news is we are talking much more about mental health. It is a conversation that many people are having. It is really impacting folks at all levels. And we can think of the pandemic, social unrest, injustices around the world and domestically, as well as violence. There is a lot of trauma that individually and collectively we have experienced. So what we do at Headspace Health is really try to find the best pathway for individuals. Our sort of philosophy is that everyone needs someone to talk to, even if you don't have a clinical diagnosis. So we have coaching that is 24/7, 365 days a year. And then if someone needs to see a therapist or psychiatrist, we offer that through video visit. We also have a lot of content because we know that for many people, there may be stigma associated with seeking help. They may not want to talk to anybody, but they need some support. So they can go on, get curated content related to mindfulness, meditation, and then seek support in that way on their own terms. So I think the key is having a really flexible, broad solution that is able to meet the need for a wide range of folks, a wide range of conditions, regardless of kind of what has really gotten them to that place of needing support in the first place.
That's so helpful. Thank you. And Dr. Jupal Brownlee, you're nodding. Can you talk a little bit about Accenture and how you look at mental health and what's on the table and what still might be taboo that people don't yet want to bring into the workplace?
Absolutely. I really appreciated Dr. Dana's comments this morning. And I think we've seen the same thing within our organization. We've been on a journey, I would say, probably for about 6+ years now in terms of really reframing the workplace to reflect a concept we call truly human, where people can really feel comfortable bringing their full selves to work. And that also means their mental health and where they are in their physical health, their health in terms of feeling purpose and belonging, et cetera. And now more than ever, of course, informed by the pandemic, we've had such powerful examples by leaders being able to demonstrate that transparency and vulnerability to let people know it's okay to not be okay, and that almost that it's expected that if you have a need, if you have a concern, that it's better to seek for help, that there's greater wisdom in that, rather than suffering in silence. That said, I do think there still is opportunity for people to still feel like the way that we pay attention to and have great sympathy around, say, a new cancer diagnosis or, an emergency, appendectomy or something like that. Also, that if there is a crisis in a mental health well-being state, that's articulated as well. And I think we're getting there slowly but surely. To Dr. Dana's point, I do think powerful solutions are critical to that, including Headspace, which is a part of our portfolio, but as well as the leadership behaviors and mindsets in order to make it more comfortable and I think empathetic and inclusive for our entire workforce that's global, that you might imagine would have cultural nuances in terms of being able to articulate concerns in the mental health realm.
That's great. And we are going to tease out some of those examples as the conversation continues around what leaders are doing and what that actually looks like. Esther, I want to bring you in because you, with Group Therapy Associates, you do address a lot of what Dr. Duperval-Brownlee just mentioned around inclusivity and accessing and giving access to maybe some groups that either were traditionally marginalized from this topic or need some special care. So can you talk about what you do?
Absolutely. So, I've been in this field I'm going to apologize on the front end for the construction noise. They just decided to start working as soon as we jumped on. But, I've been working in this field for about 20 years. And so just in my work with communities and things like that, what I've come to recognize is that when we talk about things like accessibility, apologize again. It's not just about things like financial access and things like that. Actually seeing people and having professionals who are comfortable talking about a lot of the emotional and social barriers is one of the bigger sort of factors to improving accessibility across the board and making mental health care feel more diverse and inclusive. And I really, both the other women on the panel and sharing, talking about also doing things outside of the traditional office. So as somebody who runs a private practice, obviously my focus is very much on talk therapy, seeing somebody once a week and for an hour, but there's a lot of value in developing things like what Headspace does and programs inside workplaces that actually really does address the diversity issues in mental health care.
Thank you. Yeah, you weren't kidding about the noise, but we could hear you just fine. So please no stress about that. In the spirit of talking about some of these examples and what companies are doing well, let's start with leaders. And we heard in the panel before about how CEOs and VPs and then the rest of the organization, they all kind of have different agendas with how they drive change. And mental health and how we look at it as a society and as a workplace is a change. So let's start with top management and CEO level decisions and maybe one level down. And then we can absolutely talk about managers and individuals as well. But let's talk about senior level leaders. What are some examples of things that they're doing to make mental health either less of a stigma or really giving people in their companies resources? And that's really open to Dr. Udall or Dr. Duperval-Brownlee.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think this is really important, and I think that these conversations can start at the top. So it's important for senior leaders, C-suite, for example, to be very real to the extent that they're comfortable talking about their own struggles. And sometimes when I say that, I see people sort of respond and they think, oh no, do I have to share my whole story? And the answer is no. But if you can talk about something like, I'm struggling with sleep, or I know how stressful these last couple of weeks have been, I'm feeling impacted, I know many others are, even something as simple as that can really set the tone. So I think that having those conversations, being vulnerable, is really important. I also think it's important that we have a really broad view of mental health. So one of the things that a lot of companies are doing is investing in employee resource groups, ERGs, and that's an incredibly important way to sort of send the message that who we are and our identities, our lived experience is really important in the workplace. That can have a tremendous benefit to mental health. And then talking about resources. So talking about, what is available to folks. How do we make sure that those who are in direct management are having the conversation so that they feel comfortable bringing up issues related to mental health? I think all of those are really important, but I think it has to start at the top from folks who are really willing to go out on a ledge and have those conversations.
And it feels like kind of easy for a CEO to do that, because what's a CEO going to lose? Potentially other things, but that feels like a easier conversation for someone who's in a senior leader position. But test my thinking. Is that incorrect? Are senior leaders having trouble offering this type of vulnerability as it leads into mental health?
Well, I would say it depends on the industry and the culture of the organization. So there certainly are some and there are many organizations where it would just not feel comfortable to say these things. So I think it's important to think holistically, to start sort of gently, to test it out, maybe to plant the seeds with a smaller group first, to see what the buy-in is, to see what the reaction is, to work on messaging. But I absolutely think that there are some even C-suite folks and CEOs who would say, no, I don't want to say that, I'm not comfortable. That's not how I was raised. That's not consistent with my values. And that's important too, because, I think we as a culture are moving toward transparency, and there's some real benefits to that. But that doesn't mean that everybody feels the need or would feel comfortable sort of going forward in that way. So we have to find a way to really make it tailored to the individual and the culture that feels consistent and congruent with who they are.
Do others want to weigh in? Dr. Duperval Brownlee?
Yeah, I don't mind. I agree wholeheartedly with what Dana shared. I think that the opportunity in organizations, it does start at the top, and it can be, I think, to the comfort level of the senior executive, the CEO, in terms of being transparent and vulnerable. But it really costs little, as you mentioned before, to be able to extend the resources, so to speak, ensuring that there is equitable access throughout the entire organization. And I think most importantly, realizing that because it's said at the level of the CEO doesn't mean that it's definitely edict and that'll actually be done, that the power of champions, especially peers in the organization, are quite important as well. And the leader putting a stake and sponsorship behind those champions, I think, is critical. In our organization, I would probably account that the strongest, I would say, tool that we have is our core of mental health allies, which are 10,000 trained individuals throughout the globe that are really peers, to be able to recognize that we go through things, and particularly through the pandemic, we've all been through things. How to be able to educate one another, how to be able to spot when someone may be in distress or experiencing challenges with their mental health, but not quite sure where to go, point to resources, even hold sessions to be able to continue to educate and inform in that regard. Supplement that with a platform that gives an array of resources, because there is no one size fits all, I think is very important. And of course, that's amplified further by an employee resource group or ERG. But I think wholeheartedly, reflecting on the original question you asked, Roshana, it really starts with, I think, a holistic imperative in recognizing that where we are in mid 2022, that never before has the health of a business been more directly tied and relevant to the health of the people of its business. So if that isn't a priority and it's not strategic, then there's a real big missed opportunity. And this is health in a big perspective. This is physical, this is mental, this is financial, relational, purposeful, all of which have taken hits, within the past 3 years. But definitely what's risen to the top is emotional and mental. And I think being able to articulate that and establishing this bridge of trust with people that they're leading does wonders in terms of being able to make the imperative and the encouragement for seeking help authentic and engaging.
Yeah, the landscape of mental health is changing, and also the landscape of the workforce is changing. So Esther, I think you're probably the best person to weigh in around some of those groups we talked about, marginalized groups, even Gen Z and 18 to 25-year-olds. The workforce that they're going into, some of these leaders might look a little bit differently than they do. So can you talk a little bit about the changing tide of demographics and how they are being brought into the conversation and getting resources that they need?
Yeah, I really appreciate, I think it was Dana who mentioned, sometimes we have people in the C-suite and in leadership who that's not the culture that they grew up in, whether that's on a personal level as well as professionally in their industry. And I do think that sometimes that creates some disconnect with both marginalized groups, just, whether that's people of color, women, as well as younger generations, who really are growing up with a level of transparency and comfort discussing. They have an expectation, is what I'm often finding, of that work should care about how I feel after I leave work. And certainly we can, in a separate conversation, talk about what those boundaries look like and the limitations of that. But I do think that having leadership that finds ways to demonstrate in very practical, experiential ways. So ERGs are important, offering resources are important, but what I'm finding is if people in those groups are not seeing anyone from leadership participating in that, taking those trainings, talking about actually utilizing some of the resources, then it can feel more performative, even if that's not the intention. And so I do think that there's a lot of value, and I can say, sort of on a more clinical side, my tendency is to work with a lot of people in the C-suite, and so some of the things that even as like finding a therapist or a coach to work with, so that you feel in your position of leadership that there's a place to manage your stress and your mental health issues, so that then it's a lot easier then to figure out, I can pick and choose which pieces of this feel appropriate in the workplace for my position, so I can share it and be not only offer resources, but be a role model for how to utilize them.
Yeah, lots of nods. It's interesting because I actually worked for Accenture for 14 years. So it's really delightful to hear when I saw your appointment. And I've worked in leadership development. And so when I hear the word coaching has always been the safe way to get leaders to do, all the leadership things like delegating and managerial things and such. Therapy never really quite allowed within that boundary. So I'm seeing some nods, which wherever we are with that, I'd love to hear some comments on how welcoming now we are to including those topics into coaching as well. But the other thing that I wanted to just ask is that, you talked about at Accenture, 10,000 trained individuals. And what does it take for someone to be that individual? And what kind of training did they get? Are these just really emotionally intelligent people that signed up? Are they people who have shown that they have no mental health issues? How do you pick those people so that you can activate this grassroots change? And that's really open to anyone who wants to comment.
I'll start with, since I mentioned about the allies that we have at Accenture, they're not the perfect people. They are definitely people who have transparently felt safe to be able to share the experiences that they went through in their professional journey and personal journey, and realize that in order to ensure that their colleagues don't experience the same type of issues, then allow my experience to serve as both a witness and to be an advocate for others. So these are often individuals who do have high emotional intelligence, but have suffered, in some way, shape, or form from mental health, or have been a caregiver or firsthand experiential to observing a colleague and figure I can experience in my advocacy. And it's really a holistic training started by a great colleague of mine, Alison Capito, in an organization several years ago, recognizing that there is power in numbers, especially given the size and breadth and cultural diversity of Accenture. And what greater power might there be than a colleague who you work alongside, who you trust, who you end up being a part of your family sometimes, to serve as a help for you. But I think that's extremely powerful. And to the question about therapy, certainly I think there are great examples that are offered in terms of leaders and managers sharing about their own personal therapy experiences, and not making it too deep or uncomfortable for people, but just to be able to share, for example,
I use Talkspace, because I was going through a really hard time, and I love the opportunity to have a healthcare provider on demand to help me through my issues. And just as a person would use a performance coach for leadership or for perfecting my very amateurish status as a runner, I would use it for my health, my mental health wellness as well.
I really appreciate that you brought up that sort of distinction, and that therapy is often sort of like, it's difficult to introduce, and for a lot of reasons. And one of the things I love Tamara talking about, training people to sort of be volunteers. And I think it's actually a really great opportunity to bring therapists into the workspace, because what I've found really over the years is that part of the, I always say, like, we sometimes misconstrue confidentiality with secrecy. And so sometimes we just don't talk about what therapy is really like. What's it like to work with a therapist? What are these experiences? And we are getting better at that. But I think trainings to help employees and volunteers get comfortable just generally talking about mental health, and having actual therapists come in and perform that kind of training and services, is this also like very easy way to bring a therapist into the space, so that people can start to get comfortable with the idea that therapy and work don't have to be quite so separated. And I think that my company included group therapy. So we do a lot of workshops and trainings and facilitation. We work with co-working spaces, but I have a lot of colleagues who are doing similar work. And I think as we can start to see that, particularly in larger corporations, that it is also this very subtle way of saying, like, coaching it can be helpful for a lot of things, but there's also no shame. And it's actually really important to bring in therapists who are actual licensed mental health providers to address a number of different things, and that doesn't always have to be a scary experience.
And I would just add, I am a big fan of coaching. Coaching has really evolved in the past maybe 10 to 20 years, and we have just become accredited under the National Board of Health and Wellness coaching to train our own coaches, to train folks to eventually sit for the national exam and pass the exam. So coaching is a really scalable solution. We know that there is a huge supply-demand imbalance. And so in addition to the stigma and the sort of discomfort some folks may have with therapy, we also know that there are not enough therapists and psychiatrists. There probably never will be. So coaching is a really fungible, easy to scale supply that will really help folks come in. And for many folks, it is more accessible. It feels more culturally congruent to say, I'm going to talk to my coach about sleep, and then maybe I'm going to need a therapist down the road. But that is a great way to start the conversation. It allows us to also do prevention work, which is hugely important. So if we can reach people early on, teach them skills, that helps us potentially ward off some of those diagnoses down the road. It gets somebody into the system and familiar with seeking mental health support, and it allows us to scale. So there are so many benefits from using highly trained coaches.
As you talk about that prevention work, everything we do is in a system. And I think in the last 2 years in particular, we have seen that everything we do is interacting, and our children are affected, or our adult parents are affected. So to that, and this reflects a little bit of a question that's in the chat, which is around children or school systems. And even maybe we can even start with this notion of paying it forward, or being the change that then you can offer to other people. Are we seeing adults who are in the workplace able to take these things and help their families? Are we not there yet? And what else could be happening at the schools to do this preventative work that you just mentioned?
Well, I would love to just jump. Oh, sorry about that, Tamara. I absolutely, and it's one of the reasons I love, listening to Dana talk about what Headspace Health is doing, and Tamara talking about what's happening at Accenture. Like, when we provide access to better mental health care, emotional support for adults, that absolutely, a lot of the work that I've done in the past is in family therapy and working with children. Absolutely, that is a place where trickle down effects really work. Healthy, stable adults are able to support children. One thing I do want to mention, which I just think is a great training and advocacy or program that's available, is something called mental health first aid, which is a training program that I know some of the school districts in the area that I am have brought into schools, where teachers, administrators, and even parents get to learn in, like any other first aid course, exactly what to do to understand warning signs, to understand how to broach conversations, to understand what level of resources to, whether we're at a prevention place or doing crisis intervention, how do we help students access what they really need? And, as Dana mentioned, there is such a shortage of sometimes therapists and psychiatrists to intervene when we're at crisis. So I think mental health first aid, along with some of the other things that I'm sure these ladies will talk about, are really great ways for us to intervene early, create prevention. And a lot of mental health care is about developing those coping strategies and awareness early. So the more adults we get, in a place where they can do that in school systems, I think the better off our kids are going to be.
I think we found it really interesting that persons within our organizations who are parents or who are caregivers want to talk about it in the workplace, actually. And certainly there's been no shortage of crises or global events that have really given that, to arise. And either through our mental health employee resource group or our parents resource group, we've had lots of powerful conversations, brought in professional therapists and trauma specialists to be able to talk to parents about how do you actually have this conversation with your kiddo about, be it crisis in Ukraine, or how we'll continue to thrive, through the COVID-19 pandemic, and be able to really wrestle, age appropriate with those issues coming forward. Another thing that we've done that has been extremely powerful is that we've partnered with Thrive Global under the leadership of Ariana Huffington, has provided a number of offerings to support our people, first and foremost, about how to put that oxygen mask on first, in order to address these issues, and then better care for those, who are part of your village. But they have a new offering related and targeted for kids and caregivers that's also proven to have some powerful effect as well in equipping people to have those conversations.
I would add, I think it really takes addressing both families and adolescents or children. And we recently rolled out adolescent services to 13 to 17-year-olds. The Headspace app is also free to all teens. And that's important because if we can really start to teach skills early so that youth can learn things like mindfulness and meditation, learn how to regulate if they find that they're getting overwhelmed, if they're feeling agitated or irritable, or as though the world is just too much, that is a really powerful intervention that we can start to teach earlier. So that's incredibly important, as well as having these conversations with parents. I think of teachers too as being so under-resourced, that teachers did not have much training to deal with the level of trauma and symptoms that are being played out and that are seen in the classroom on a regular basis. So there is a lot of need right now, and we need to be both teaching and attending to the adults as well as the kiddos who are in their care, so that we can really try to address these things holistically.
Yeah, we had two great suggestions as examples. I love the mental health first aid, like a first aid course. And you take CPR and that's offered. This is really important. So that's a great tip and tool. And the Headspace app being free to all teens, that's amazing. And so everybody who's listening, if you have teens, please, make use of these resources. I think that's really great. And it's very interesting. I remember during the pandemic, I said, because I'm not a licensed psychologist, but I'm a workplace psychologist. And so I said, gosh, wouldn't it be amazing if literally 50% of the population were a therapist? So you could just look to your right or look to your left and you knew you would have someone. And you've actually been doing that. Dr. Udall, I'll ask you, because essentially Headspace and some of the other tools that Accenture and some of these other groups have been using offer that. It's on-demand, quality, licensed therapy tools. And so can you talk about technology and what that's done and what the outlook could be for mental health using technology?
Well, I think the outlook overall is very promising. We are excited about all of the possible ways that technology can allow us to innovate and to scale and to reach under-resourced and historically excluded groups. So we know that, as we've talked about today, some folks are just not comfortable seeking care. But if you can connect with somebody on the ease through a smartphone, and this could be 24 hours a day. We saw, for example, early in the pandemic, a 50% uptick in overnight utilization. And that's a good thing, and that people are reaching out to their coaches rather than hopefully doom scrolling or doing other things. But it really signals the fact that folks are not sleeping and that they may be dealing with anxiety and depression. So technology has the possibility of really going into people's homes and reaching them in a very accessible way. 50% of US counties have no mental health provider. So there is a lot of reason to really be optimistic. We need to continue to focus on quality and outcomes. There has been a lot of interest, a lot of money going into funding telehealth. That is wonderful. I was actually on the Hill yesterday doing some congressional meetings. There's a lot of interest. We have to continue to really talk about quality and outcomes because we are scaling so quickly and there is so much that is going into this. But we're really optimistic for all of those reasons.
I'll comment briefly if I can, Roshana. I agree with Dana wholeheartedly, and I was thinking about just how many embedded tools that we have available to our employees globally in order to, because we are, in a sense, technology company, at this point, and Headspace is one of them, for example, embedded within our Teams application, which everyone uses every day, throughout the day, as an example. So I think looking for smart ways to be able to incorporate resources and services that serve, not hinder, already established work processes are going to be key. And I think that's a real ripe place for innovation. That said, we're also really excited about things that are not yet tested, but certainly areas that need to be looked at critically for quality and outcomes, to Dana's point. So for example, in the metaverse, there's so much that is talked about now, and that's happening, especially from an engagement perspective, an entertainment perspective, retail perspective, even in the metaverse. And that as more people are adopting to that, what might be the applications of providing services, for people in the metaverse, even integrated in the work processes that we're starting to reveal and unfold today.
I started this panel by saying we have a heavy topic, and it is a heavy topic, but it feels a little bit brighter to me as we're talking about some of these opportunities and technology, the metaverse. I mean, you took it even further, and the metaverse can really provide us even more opportunities. And we won't talk today about social media and the downfalls of those kinds of things, because those will obviously, of course, be factors in ongoing mental health. But the good pieces of technology, to me also, Esther, I'm going to ask you, because you've talked about how there is distrust in a lot of the healthcare systems in the Black community and maybe other communities. Can you talk a little bit also about whether it's technology or other ways that we can make mental health accessible in a way that people can feel like they trust?
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly share Dana and Tamara's optimism about the use of technology. I think in lots of ways it does make things much more accessible, and for people who may be uncomfortable or overwhelmed by the process of seeking an individual to work with. I think the other side of this that we have to be really mindful, though, is that although we're providing a much more convenient format and platforms and making it really accessible in ways, we still have to also be thoughtful. Is the content, are the providers that are, sort of on these platforms and in, utilizing technology, are they culturally attuned? Are they speaking to the, whether it's racial or cultural sort of dynamics that create distrust in the healthcare system? And so I think that there's, going back to that piece of like sort of making sure we're also looking at quality and outcomes, is how many people are going, oh, this is great and it's accessible, but then finding that maybe they don't feel as though they're being heard, or that, their experience of certain factors, is shaped by their culture and racial identities and experiences and histories. And are we creating content and, again, services that really speak to that? And so I think it's this amazing opportunity that, as long as we're kind of also making sure we're coming along with the content piece, and we're coming along in the same way that therapists in their offices need to learn how to be relevant and educated and comfortable discussing those things, we have to make sure that, anything that we're doing based on a technology platform is doing the same.
Thank you. We have some questions from the audience that I'm going to offer now. But as I transition into some of those questions, it's very interesting, Esther. One of the things I've learned in coaching training and some of the therapy stuff that I did as my master's in psychology was also noticing what's happening in the room. And I've noticed quite literally that the construction has gotten quieter as we've been talking. So it's almost like this meta experience of what we can do to silence our heads in order to have productive conversations. So you've role modeled that kind of for us. Let me ask a couple of questions from the audience. And one of the big themes that we're kind of hearing is that work can be a stressor in and of itself for the very people that we as workplace therapists are trying to help people with. So candidly speaking, is it worth the investment? And this is a question from the audience. Is it worth the investment in all this mental health stuff, or can we solve the problem by paying people better, giving them more work-life flexibility? Comments on that?
I'll just jump in quickly to say I just think that it's a both and, which is a very therapist answer for me to give. But I think if we want to solve that, it's not one or the other. It has to be both and, because obviously we're clear that there's such an intersection between those things.
I would say one of the things that we spend a lot of time on is making sure, because our workforce at Headspace Health is a large percentage of care providers. And so we really want to make sure that we're looking at things like burnout, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue. And so we are regularly having those conversations, monitoring those things on our team. We're also talking to managers about the fact that you may not be able to expect your employees to show up in the same way right now. They may literally be off camera. They may need to take time off. They may need a more flexible work schedule. So these are all conversations to be had. I do think we have to treat mental health needs. Many people get their needs met through their employer. So it is incumbent upon employers to really provide great care. And we have to look at the work environment. I think the kind of always on, many people still working from home, the fact that you can do work from your cell phone or your laptop anywhere means that we often are doing work all the time. So I think helping managers and employees really understand those boundaries and the importance of really creating those boundaries for work-life balance, resilient sustainability is incredibly important. So I totally agree with the both and. That is a therapist answer, but it seems like the right one to me as well.
And Dr. Udall, you mentioned you've been, you said I think you were down on the Hill presenting. And can you talk about, or anyone, one of the questions that came in was around Medicare and funding through health plans for mental health. Is that changing? And I give one kind of parallel example around parental leave and caregiver leave. That's been a real thing we've seen a lot of companies taking up and changing. Is the same thing happening with mental health and affordability through healthcare plans?
Well, I would say that the pandemic has really accelerated a lot of interest in mental health. There has been interest in telehealth. The focus on mental health is becoming much more pronounced. Lots of bipartisan support for many bills, many sort of funding initiatives that would have to do with mental health. A lot of the work we were talking about yesterday is about Medicare and whether there's to be an in-person requirement for services. And that's important because in many communities, there is no in-person provider that's really accessible. And so that is the benefit of telehealth, is being able to go in and offer these timely appointments for folks who live in places where there just are not other resources available. So I think there's a lot of interest and conversation about this now. This is one of the silver linings of the pandemic, is that these things are given much more attention and they're really being heard at all levels much more than they were years ago.
I will just say, just on the provider side, that I absolutely agree. I mean, I certainly see those same changes. And I think the bigger for in-person, that is such a slower process, because even as telehealth is being covered and, some of those, the changes are happening, then we also have to look at sort of state regulations around telehealth is covered. But then if you're licensed in Virginia, you can't see somebody in DC, even if it's 15 minutes away. And so I think it's one of the reasons that, again, the things that are happening at Accenture, the stuff that Dana, you're creating with Headspace is so important, because while there's progress, that progress can be a little bit slow when we start to look at policy, larger policy and legislation regulations. So we definitely need those other services to make sure that whether it's telehealth or in person, in the meantime, people are getting what they need.
Yeah, thank you. As things change, and it's great, the bipartisan support I think is fantastic. So as things are continuing to change and expand, I'll go back to almost the first question, because now a couple of questions have come in the chat around other things that can they be considered as part of this discussion. Things like menopause, things like addiction. Companies still have happy hours to help people cope with stress. And are those topics or other topics on the table as we look forward into mental health?
I believe so. I will say it really starts with an organization's commitment to true, inclusivity, diversity, equity, and really considering the offerings that they're having and how their workforce or their employees might be affected. So I think to the point, for example, I've heard very refreshingly within our organization about how people are thinking very differently about happy hours, that they're dry happy hours, they're actually fun happy hours, if you will, that is really more fostering emotional and mental health and well-being, as opposed to the focus around, say, a substance or alcohol, in that regard. Not to the exclusiveness of it, but I think just with greater sensitivity that people are experiencing it. I also am in feeling that there is, because this door has been opened for people to be able to discuss what's happening with them and wanting to be more authentic and bringing their whole selves to work, it also means talking about other taboo issues like menopause. There's a powerful, I would say, movement within our organization, to talk about it. And it's so widely accepted, not only by those who identify as women or care for women, but because we have a goal within our organization for, gender parity by 2025, which means that half your workforce are going to be women, which means that some percentage are going to experience, these seasons related to reproductive health. And why not, have some form or conversation about it if it contributes to a person's health and well-being, if we're really going to make the people, of the business a priority so that they can really perform at their best selves. So I do see those changing fairly rapidly. And maybe our organization could be an exception to that. So I don't want to put a sense that this is happening everywhere, but I do feel like, I think to the point that Dr. Dana made earlier, there's been this gift of the pandemic of being able to really explore what people need in order to thrive and perform well at work. Not to mention what the youngest generation of the workforce are demanding as well. It is not about how can I get to, the highest levels of the organization in X amount of time. It's like, for the time that I'm here, I want to make sure that, it's an environment that is nourishing to me, that my health, my wellness, and my mental health is prioritized. And so how can the company then respond, which is a great demand, I think, and a great clarion call to organizations today to really think about culture, work processes. How are we talking? How are we identifying people? How are we respecting them in all that we do?
Some of our recent research has shown that folks are actually making decisions based on which jobs to take based on benefits packages, and mental health and wellness are at the top of the list. We're also have some recent research that we participated in that showed that people, exactly as you were saying, are expecting that their employers will care about their health, that they really want to be cared for, that they feel as though that is a sort of reasonable requirement, which we would agree with. But these things are really coming up much more in a work setting. So I think that that's important, because I do think that it becomes, again, incumbent upon us to really show that we are prioritizing mental health and offering great benefits. One of the other findings from this research that we just did was on the fact that CEOs are very aware of and think that they're providing a high degree of mental health wellness and support for folks in the organization. There is a disconnect there. So that is not seen by many different employees. And so I think that that is also really part of this conversation is, again, how does leadership show what we are doing, really standing by it, making sure that that messaging is flowing throughout the organization and holding true so that individuals are comfortable and able to speak up about things like menopause, which were not part of the conversation in the past and are definitely becoming more so now. So I agree with you, Dr. Tamara.
Esther, I'd love to hear you as well from the provider side. What are there new issues that people are bringing up now that they never thought kind of fell into this bucket, or now that they feel, wow, this really has been something that's the most important thing to me now, I feel like I have a little bit more accessibility to weigh those? Are you seeing that?
I think I'm seeing it just generally in a space where people are doing a lot less compartmentalizing, right? Like, so it's less like, well, menopause is for my, my gynecologist, and, my heart health is only for my, primary care, and this is only for, and really beginning to move into this space of like, health is holistic, right? And so the things you're talking about to your doctor, you also probably should be talking about with your therapist. And I agree with obviously both of you that I'm seeing a lot more people coming through our practice who really do have expectations, who either are getting a lot of support at work, and if they're not getting a lot of support through their employer, then that also becomes part of the conversation of, well, is it time for me to look at other options, making changes like to support, anecdotally what Dana was saying about the research in terms of really recognizing too that sometimes leadership as a whole doesn't reflect the life experiences of the rest of the organization. And so sometimes what is perceived as helpful, if we're not asking the rest of the organization, they're like, well, actually, these are not the things I need. What I really need is this instead. And so I think I think in the long run, it's a good thing. I think there's a lot more conversation and really employers and individuals starting to see health as a holistic experience.
Yeah, you talk about decompartmentalizing, and I had never thought of it that way. But I have been asking myself, and now I'll ask all of you, where's the home for mental health in an organization? So to me, it sort of feels traditionally we compartmentalize it into ERGs as one example. But sometimes ERGs or diversity and inclusion haven't yet really been funded in the way that we would like them to be, or they aren't necessarily, may not be the right home for it. So can you talk a little bit also, any of the three of you, about what's the proper home for where mental health sits in a company?
I think it was kind of smiling because we've had this conversation internally at Accenture, like where should this live? And now that I'm at Accenture, and that there is an Office of Health and Wellbeing, I think there's an organic, kind of living place in terms of, the place where strategies and offerings, and services that are addressing health and well-being for our people, would live in a place. But the conversation that I've had with our leaders, for example, in inclusion and diversity, in employee benefits, rewards, is that actually there's a shared accountability and responsibility. And rather than thinking like, oh, it should be underneath this office, we need to make a big table, to address the issues of mental health, and realizing that there's various parts to an organization that really impacts a person's mental health. Surely the services and resources are going to be critical for that. But the dimensions that we've talked about even in this conversation, what about leadership engagement and being able to coach them in the mindsets and the behaviors towards that end? What about the influence of our technology center so that the interactions that our employees would have towards the new technologies are actually relevant and culturally humble and reflective, and accessible, for example, for a very global and diverse workforce? Yes, inclusion and diversity needs to be there for those very same reasons, as well as the experience, because we know that It's almost like, back in the 80s, we talked about what's happening in the world. It's like it's the economy. It's like, well, for us, it's the culture, and certainly the persons who have opportunities to impact culture and the levers of culture need to be at that table as well. So I'm believing in a long table, for example, in terms of where this should live, knowing that there's very distinct accountabilities and responsibilities that need to be had. But having a person like myself, and there are organizations now that are thinking about having roles like this, or have them, like a chief health officer or chief well-being officer, so that there can be a locus, to bring people together at the table. But I think intentionally having a broad table is important for communication, for clarity of vision and execution.
I don't think I have much to add. That was said beautifully. I really like the idea of the long table. I think that that's really important because, for example, if you have somebody that's in an engineering or marketing department, how they might talk to their team about mental health and the needs of those individuals might be much different than, for example, in my org under the all care provider. So I think that that level of kind of familiarity and understanding of the culture of a particular group is really important. So I like the idea of the distributed responsibility. That's the most powerful way to go.
I strategically put myself off mute just as enough time to see if Esther, you wanted to weigh in, but you actually kicked off that question. So bit full circle. We've just got about 5 more minutes, and there's a really great discussion happening in the chat. And so everybody that's watching, we are looking at the chat and seeing all of your great comments come in. And a lot of people are continuing to weigh in on things like menopause, perimenopause, and some other issues as well, bereavement as well. So we unfortunately only have 5 more minutes, but clearly this is such a meaty topic. Maybe we bring it back to the individual for just a moment and leave all of us with a piece of a feeling of resourcefulness of what's one thing that we can each do in order to put into practice maybe the vision that you would want us to one day achieve, either with our families, something we can do with our teams. Open question for each of us to be able to take away some of your wisdom on things we can do.
That's a tough one. I think there's so much. I'm a physician by background, and I think about like how I would counsel patients, that would come into care, and I would say 40% of my practice was actually related to issues of emotional and mental health, and I often had the pleasure and opportunity to really speak life to people and really remind them that there's really only one you, and that there are many parts to you. And as the visit was prompted perhaps by physical concern, it is very closely tied to your financial health, your relational health, your purpose in life, where you belong, as well as your emotional and mental health, and not to forsake that dimension of your life, and the power that it has to impact your overall health and well-being. And the importance of really realizing that there will be moments where you're not going to be okay. And that's all right, because our lives are a journey. It's a book made of many chapters. I think the power is the chapter that recognizes when you weren't okay, you got help, and that you were able to rest in it, give yourself grace and space, and pace yourself, to a place of recovery. I think my hope for everyone is that they would be able to engage in that chapter of their book, of their life's journey, to give themselves pace in what they do, space and grace when it comes to paying attention to emotional and mental health, and realizing the power of being able to ask for help and receive it.
Oh. Esther, you go ahead.
Okay, well, just I think building off of what Tamara was talking about, if I could leave everybody with one thing, it would be that self-compassion is probably the greatest gift you're going to give yourself and everybody else. I think, even in this conversation, right, we have big goals and big hopes for what the future looks like and how we can help other people and what organizations can do. And that can create so much pressure to do. And so really, I just want to encourage everybody to, it's also important for us to like pause and to slow down a little bit and to really kind of check in, like, how well am I listening to all the things that I need physically, emotionally, all of that? And being compassionate in those spaces where you feel like you wish you were doing more or you made a mistake or whatever that looks like. But in that space, you really do cultivate an opportunity to